So we need more such unauthorized disclosures. We need the courage of people like Bradley Manning, who are willing to take a risk or even pay a cost to put it out, if we are to have any chance of actually changing these policies and the values in the system that lead to them. I'll just close by saying I'm often asked, why do I say that I think Bradley Manning is a hero of mine? And for this reason, in a way. If he is convicted and people want to execute him, I don't mean just people on the street, I mean people in Congress want him to be tried for treason and to be executed. If that happened, he would be the first American to be executed for giving secrets to Americans since Nathan Hale, who said, "I regret I have but one life to give for my country." Bradley Manning has clearly shown himself to be someone who is willing to give his life in prison for his country. And you can't be more patriotic than that. And he is a hero of mine. Thank you. In Vietnam. And having done a series of lectures once on the art of coercion and the theory and practice of blackmail, an analytical study of the use of threats, it was a specialty of mine, academic. And so I was applying that to our bombing program against North Vietnam, which had already been called, I didn't invent the term, coercive diplomacy, affecting negotiations by bombing. And by threatening bombing. And the reason I mention all this is that I remember to a very high-level bunch of people, former assistant secretaries and secretaries, not secretaries, assistant secretaries and deputy assistant secretaries in this group. I happened to ask in the course of it something I didn't think of the word for. I said, what's the word for a kind of coercion that doesn't involve simply threats, a threatening process, which is essence of coercion, a threatening process that actually involves hurting someone in the course of actually bombing them, which is what we were doing. We were bombing them in order to threaten them with more bombing if they didn't do what we wanted. And nobody could think. We came up with a couple terms, but didn't get a good answer to that. Okay. I've already copied the Pentagon Papers and those things. In the spring of 1971, I had given them now to Fulbright, the papers in 69 of the Finland Foreign Relations Committee. He didn't bring them out because he was afraid he would be punished by the Defense Department for putting out these classified documents. They couldn't say he'd done anything illegal. He had a right as a senator, certainly, to do this. But they might switch foreign military aid appropriations from his committee to armed services. And so he preferred to let me put them out, in fact, and not put them out himself, which he could do without risk. So a year goes by, and the question, he hasn't put them out, so the question is, should I give them to the newspapers? At which point, Patricia here said to me, and she had only, I'd never let her see any of these papers up till this point. I didn't want her fingerprints on them. So she could say, I had no part in this. I didn't. So she said, here you're talking about going to the press with this now, and Fulbright doesn't think it's important enough to put it out. What makes you so sure that it's worth it? Because Fulbright had said, having decided not to put them out, he said, well, at first he was very enthusiastic, but then when he thought better of it, he said, well, after all, isn't it only history? And so Patricia raised this and said, how can you be so sure it's worth it? I said, well, I can't. But, they may be right. But they haven't read them. I'm the only one who's read these papers. So I have to rely on my own judgment here. I can't rely on their judgment. And I think it is worth it. Well, on another discussion we had on the same subject at the same time, I said, this is the first 23-year record of imperial operations And I'm sure if we look back at Assyria, or Rome, or Greece, or any of the Egyptian empires, their minutes would read the same. But we don't have those. And this is a record of what a big country does that wants to intimidate and bomb into submission over a 23-year period. So it's even if it doesn't have an immediate effect, it will be enlightening in the future. But at this point, in about February 71, I said to Patricia, okay, I think the time has come when you have to see some of these and form an opinion so you can give me your judgment. So I picked out some documents, including documents from the very period I worked on, 64, 65, where we were preparing the bombing and beginning to carry it out. Just one chapter of this 7,000-page study. So she went into the bedroom, basically a one living room and a bedroom. And she went in and for quite a while, came out, and there were tears in her eyes. And she said, listen to this. And she started quoting from things that she'd read there. And I remember the quotes because I read them when I was in the Pentagon. They were descriptions of the nature of the bombing program we were going to carry out. They called it some people said there should be an on-off aspect to it. Give them a little relief and then start it again. They called that the water drip technique, or waterboarding, we would now call it. Another turn of the screw is worthwhile. Raise the ratchet on this, like the torture. Anyway, raising the ratchet. Another, increasing the level of pain. And Patricia said, crying, this is the language of torturers. And that went through me like a knife, because here I was 40 years old in the government. I'd been in this process since 1961, 64. And I never realized that what I was in, which I was against and wanted to stop, and already saw as a kind of murder. But I never thought of this torture, which happened to be one of the things I said to myself, I will never, ever be part of. And I have been part of that. And it was torturing a country. The point of it was to torture a country. Now, it isn't actually the best word for that. We didn't use the word terror or terrorism very much. Terrorism is a better word. It was strictly terrorism. It was killing civilians, not just harming them. Killing them in order to intimidate others and affect the deliberate killing of non-combatants for a combatant purpose. So if she said terrorism again, I would have reacted similarly. But torture was the word that was in my head. And it was shattering, actually, to realize that I had managed to deny that to myself, even at this late date when I'd already given the Pentagon papers. Well, that's the kind of perception that leads to the kind of leak that the Pentagon can't stop, like Bradley Manning's or the WikiLeaks or the Pentagon Papers, because if they implement all of those new restrictions that they have in mind, which is 20 pages of them, that wouldn't stop somebody who's willing to pay a cost. Because mostly it has to do with being able to detect who has downloaded something, now in the digital age, who has downloaded something that they shouldn't have had access to, who has been downloading too much stuff, like Brandon. And you can later, retroactively get at them and punish them. But if they're willing to be punished, you really can't stop that. And it could get out. And WikiLeaks exists to facilitate people who are willing to take that risk. And actually they want to lower the risks by making it anonymous, truly anonymous. And indeed, Bradley Manning might well have gotten away with it, even with that huge volume, had he not unburdened himself to Adrian Lamo for reasons that really we don't know why he did that. Those parts of the chat logs have not been released. And Wired magazine here in San Francisco has refused to put out the 75% of the chat logs that might well reveal how Lamo got Manning to tell him what he was doing, and which Lamo reported to the FBI, and who got Lamo to do that. It's another story. So anyway, We need WikiLeaks. We need unauthorized disclosures. Yes, there can be some that are harmful. There are secrets that deserve to be kept and should be kept. Which, by the way, Julian Assange agrees. He has, for example, redacted, since the first releases, all the names of informants, and fairly effectively. No informant has been harmed, according to him. So he doesn't say everything should come out. But it's not secret, it's not leaks or excessive openness that got us into Iraq or Afghanistan or Yemen. I'll get to that. Or Pakistan right now. It is not too little secrecy. On the contrary, it's the culpable secrecy, the abuse, if you like, of the secrecy system to conceal, above all, internal dissent, and above all, internal dissent on the grounds that certain policies are criminal, or murderous, or reckless, to go to a larger category here, reckless, dangerous, foolish, stupid. Like Vietnam, like Iraq, like Afghanistan. That's a secrecy that has put enormous numbers of lives, not just at risk, but killed them. And the two most decorated members of the armed forces during the Vietnam era, both colonels, one David Hackworth and the other Anthony Herbert. They vied, sort of, because they didn't have some overlapping medals. They both had many silver stars, bronze stars, medals. I don't know if they had the Medal of Honor. They literally were described as the most decorated men. And each of them resigned because they discovered that we were torturing people in Vietnam. And their attempts to stop that were covered up and stopped and blocked. And each of them resigned from the army. So I'm saying my attitude, I've met both of them. I recognize that. The way the officers that I dealt with, I thought all of them would have felt that way. I was shocked to discover that it was happening from them, actually. I also discovered it from my co-defendant, Tony Russo, who actually was fired from RAND nominally for a budget cut, but he was the only person who needed to cut, it seemed at that point, because he had written a report that he had discovered in Vietnam that our Vietnamese allies were routinely torturing, we were turning people over to them, and we were present during the interrogation. And that report was not regarded with favor by our U.S. Air Force sponsors, or his boss, and he was fired a couple of years before he helped me copy the papers. So that theme seems to run through. With my wife here, I want to tell a story that relates to this, how all this came into my own life, because I want to focus on this one thing revealed by WikiLeaks. Keeping in mind that another thing they're saying all the time is nothing new has been presented, nothing of interest, nothing significant, and no wrongdoing by anyone. One of the other things, by the way, from the Iraq logs is the discovery of 15,000 civilian deaths that had never been reported, that were known inside. You've heard the statement, we don't do body counts? A lie. They were doing body counts. And their body count had 15,000 people on it that no reporters had ever caught. 15,000, 5 9/11s. So no wrongdoing, no criminality. On the contrary, the torture is criminality by Obama. And not only by Obama, it's just the same as was going on in the earlier parts of the logs. In fact, one of the secrets revealed by all these logs that they put out is how little difference there is between 2008 and 2009 in any dimension. The diplomacy is the same, the aims are the same, the corruption reported is the same, the civilian casualties, the torture, the refusal to investigate. That's a secret, right? Since we have a president who said he was going to bring change. He didn't, in the area of foreign policy. Okay. I want to go back, though, to my own experience on this. I said I got out of the Marines in the 50s, in 57. The Algerian War for the French was just chilling up at that point. The Algerians who had fought for France against Indochinese in the French forces were impressed by the NLF, by what was then the Viet Minh, and by their fight for independence. And they were kind of subverted in their own relations to France, especially the ones who'd been in the prison camps under the Viet Minh from Dien Bien Phu. So they came back and they started a revolution of independence in Algeria. And in 1958, a guy named Henri Alleg, who was a communist journalist in France, was picked up and tortured. And it so happens I just read on my friend's iPad here tonight on the way over, I looked up about Henri Alleg, A-L-L-E-G, and his book, La Question, The Question, which is a pun because it means the question of torture. And La Question was the way torture was described in pre-revolutionary France. Question, torture. So he describes his torture, but what's very interesting is the efforts made by the French to ban that book, to censor it, to deny him, to keep him in jail, and whatnot, for the tortures that had been done to him by French paratroopers, including waterboarding, interestingly. And I read that book in probably in 1958. It came out in English. Started to get an introduction to it. And it made a big impression on me. Specifically, I remember being in discussion with a student that I had, and I was a teaching fellow. And he was older than I was. He was a student, but he was a German immigrant. And he had actually been in the German army at the very end of the war, very young. He was 15 or 16. And so this is now more than 10 years later. And he was a very snotty guy, very arrogant. He was older than the rest of us. And very critical, condescending toward Americans. And we were discussing somehow this issue of just war. And I said I thought there were things that the Americans wouldn't do. Like torture, what we were reading about. It just come out of the Marines. Okay, torture that was in the news because of Alleg's book, Henri Alleg, and another book by Jamila Bupacha, another person who had been tortured. So it was in the news. And there was a movement against it in France, led by Jean-Paul Sartre. And I said, I don't think Americans would do that. He said, as a German, he said, that's because you've never fought a counter-guerrilla war. I said, well, I don't know. I don't really think we would do that. And I've always remembered, he came back to me, he asked for an appointment a couple of days later. And he was not snotty for once. For once he wasn't condescending. He said he was about 5 years older than me. And he said, you know, I was discussing this at a table in LA House the other day. Foreign students, we always get together and eat together. And we discussed this, and you know, I'm beginning to think you're right. And I'm very disturbed by this. There is a cultural aspect to this. That the Germans did this, now the French were doing it. And he said, frankly, it's very disturbing to me. I have to think about it. I was struck by that. Well, all right. I go into the Defense Department later, 64, 65. I participate in the bombing program, which I was against, which I thought would be counterproductive, which might get us into war with China, the bombing of North Vietnam, and which would be a disaster. It would have no good effect, that it would only kill a lot of people. And my boss felt the same way, a law professor from Harvard, now an assistant secretary. We felt the same, but McNamara disagreed. And we worked for him, so we did what he wanted, and we did what we could to get the bombing started. I'm not proud of that. How many people have seen the movie, Most Dangerous Man? Well, you've seen this scene where I described it. The most shameful act I ever did, I think, was on orders of McNamara and my boss. I did do what I could to help get the bomb started, actually by collecting statistics of Viet Cong atrocities, which were real atrocities, mostly. But by helping publicize that, I was helping, I knew I was helping, getting a program started, which of course killed enormously more people than the Viet Cong ever did, and which I hoped. So let's remember Bradley Manning. I was actively participating in something I was totally against. But at that point, it didn't say to me, and it didn't recognize, I ought to do something about that. So I went on. I went to Vietnam. And as I say, I wasn't made aware of torture in the 2 years I was over there. Tony Russo did run across it. Colonel Herbert, Colonel Hackworth did run across it. When I read their reports, it opened my eyes. But as far as I had not been associated with that. One other little thing. After I had started copying the Pentagon Papers, I participated in a Council of Foreign Relations study group. I don't know, I've hardly ever told this. I'll tell you why I'm laughing. I'm in the Council on Foreign Relations. It's a little credential I got from my criminal past. And it ran Corporation in the Pentagon. And you can be thrown out of the Council on Foreign Relations for one thing in a minute, and that's revealing any of the inner discussions of their study groups. But I feel I can now do this because when the FBI, after I was arrested, asked them for the minutes, without a subpoena, just asked them, they turned it over. Anyway, so the FBI does have this, and I think I can mention it. J.K. Galbraith actually resigned from the council over that incident. But I was given the paper, and it was called Coercive Diplomacy. He said, I don't think I did say it wrong. Manning said, I'm ready to go to prison for life, or even be executed. And I thought, that's where I was 40 years ago. And I've waited 40 years for someone else to feel something like that or say something like that. In the sense, not that you expect many people to want to be able to face those risks, and not many people even to realize that there's a challenge to do something like that. But it's been surprising to me and puzzling that no one did it decade after decade. There were no more Pentagon Papers. I thought that there should be a Pentagon Papers every year, roughly, one subject or another, maybe every couple of months somewhere in the world. And there wasn't anything like this until WikiLeaks. And as I said, I saw that statement by Manning. I said, I've been waiting for somebody to feel that way for 40 years and to act on it. And he probably will go to prison for life. I'll say that right now. He's facing a military court. And his chances of getting out from the fact that he certainly broke military regulations, whether or not he broke a constitutional civil law, but they can get him on that. So he probably won't pay that price. From my experience of other whistleblowers, he won't regret it. Hard as it will be, it'll be terrible. But my friend Mordecai Vanunu spent 11 and a half years in solitary out of an 18-year prison sentence for revealing that Israel had a larger nuclear program than even the CIA realized. That was intended to drive him nuts, and actually it did drive him fairly nuts by about the 9th or 10th year. But when he got into the prison out of the prison population, into the general prison population, he recovered very well. He's recovered very well now. And I've asked him several times, did you ever regret what you did? He said, no, not for a minute. And I know that of other people who went through shorter sentences. I actually don't think they will break Bradley Manning, which is what they're trying to do right now. But let me now come to the big question. What gets someone into the frame of mind that they're willing to pay that kind of cost, or any big cost, in order to tell the truth? And I've been asked that quite a bit, and people make assumptions about Manning. Everything I've read about him suggests to me that his motivations were very similar to mine, and the actual incidents were very similar. That's what I want to get to. I mentioned already that he found himself turning people over for torture, and he found by translating the documents for which they were being arrested, that they were dissenting scholarly critiques of the government corruption, which he didn't think they should be arrested for. And when he went to his superior officer and did tell him, look what's happening, we're arresting people for reasons they shouldn't be arrested, and they are being tortured. And his officer said, don't worry about that, don't pursue this, just do your job, get more suspects. So, cover up. Then he came across the Apache helicopter video. Now, how many people have seen that? How many have not? Most of you have not? Yeah, take a look. Just look on YouTube. I think just say Apache helicopter attack or collateral murder, which was the headline that WikiLeaks gave it. It was a classified video taken from the gun sights of an Apache helicopter that was mowing down some 15 civilians in Baghdad. And it was, WikiLeaks put it out, deciphered it, declassified, put it out. It had been requested for 2 years by Reuters because they knew that among the civilians who were killed in that, 2 of them were their employees. One was a reporter, another a driver for the reporter. And actually one of the striking things on the video, which I encourage you to go look at, there's an 18-minute version and a 38-minute version, the whole thing. 2 aspects of it. One is you see after they've shot most of the people, who are just in civilian clothes, carrying no obvious weapons, which isn't the last word, but they shot them all down. One of them is crawling away, trying to get away in the square. There is clearly without a weapon, he's wounded. And you can see this very clearly. And a squad of Americans is on their way, as the helicopter knew, a block or 2 away, ready there to take into custody anybody who was remaining from this attack from the air. And the orders come through, get him, shoot him, and you watch them shoot this man down the street. Now some people have asked why Assange gave that the provocative title of collateral murder. Why not just say collateral damage, as we usually do? Inadvertent, mistaken, unavoidable, too bad sort of thing. I'd call it something worse than too bad, call it murder. Well, because it was murder. That's one reason. I was a Marine company commander, Marine platoon leader, battalion training officer in the 50s, 54 to 57, peacetime for the U.S., who trained people on the laws of war. Not a lot of time on it, but trained them. I knew the laws of war. I thought of myself as a Marine as very much into the just war doctrine, that not all killing in war is murder, but some is. And specifically, the deliberate killing of unarmed civilians or prisoners, or people who constitute no threat, with no weapons, is murder. And this was murder. And I had a reason, when I saw that film, of relating it to my own experience and how it affected Manning. The way he describes it, it affected him just the same way. There was a time in 1969, 5 years after I started working on Vietnam, when I read the earliest Clark's of the Pentagon Papers, and discovered that we had, from the very beginning, been backing a French reconquest of a colony that had declared its independence. An effort, and we were paying 8% of that effort. An effort that had clearly no legitimacy in American values or ideals and doctrines. It wasn't clearly illegal, by the way, that's another story, but clearly wrong and illegitimate. You couldn't call a war like that, which just proceeded seamlessly from then on, through our support of our Vietnamese puppets, and then our direct involvement starting in '65, the direct bombing. So 30 years went on with that war. Well, in 1969, I realized this war has been illegitimate from the beginning, and that means all the killing, not just the civilians, all the killing we've been over there has been unjustified. We've never had a right to kill anyone in Vietnam. No legitimate reason. There have been reasons. The officials had reasons. The corporations had reasons. Various people had reasons, but not reasons that justified what we were doing. To me, unjustified homicide spelled murder. And murder to me meant something that you didn't just decide this policy is non-optimal, inefficient, it's ill-advised, it's even mistaken. I should criticize it, try to change it. It's something that I should really make greater efforts than all that implied to stop it, if I could. Obviously, there wasn't much one person could do with any chance of stopping. They could do what I could, and what that meant to me, murder is something that is worth taking a risk to stop. And I wasn't really interested in punishing anybody, or even in the political accountability. Let's get these guys out there who got us into this. It's a perfectly legitimate democratic reason, basis of democracy. But as far as I was concerned, I knew very well that the people who got in to replace them would not have better judgment, better values, and whatnot. I wanted it to stop, and I was prepared to take a risk to my own life to do that. That's how I got there. And one other aspect that I'll come to in a minute. And that's where Bradley Manning, basically, he saw the Apache helicopter, he saw it as murder, and he saw the torture. Now, torture is one other thing that I was very convinced as a Marine officer that I would never be associated with. Again, trained on that. That was a kind of war. That was not just war. That was not just means. And I always thought, there are orders I would never accept, things I would never participate in. This was not any unique feeling for a military person. And just last week, what was it just happening? It's on the web. Of how each department is to investigate, how to stop the possibility of unauthorized disclosures. That investigation started on the day the WikiLeaks latest disclosures came out, November 28th. And one of their points is a warning signal to look for the psychological health, that's the word used, of their employees. Depression or disgruntlement. Depression or disgruntlement is in the employee, possibly. See, well, presumably what they're thinking is that a person is drinking heavily, his marriage is already faltering, he's got money troubles or various things. And I guess they're thinking, and in those circumstances, you just say, I think I'll go to prison for life. Put outside. They think that's the mood people put. I'm not aware of a single case of a leak that actually results from that, but that's the usual term. You've seen it, I'm sure, a disgruntled employee. In fact, I saw Bradley Manning described as that directly, a disgruntled employee. It reminds me, I was on my second arrest at Crawford a year or two ago, at Bush's, 2 years ago, at Bush's Ranch. For petitioning in the ditch adjacent to his ranch, which his car had to go by. It was one of the few places in the country where he had a chance actually to petition by holding up a sign that he couldn't miss, except by putting blinders up on the window or something. So we were arrested in jail, and actually the policeman, for the only time in the arrest that I've had, which is quite a few, went through an entire medical history before we went in. And the idea of that was, asthma, and this, do I need medicine? But then a psychological history as well. And see, any homosexual tendencies that might affect what cell they put you in, and I was thinking to myself, do I really want to be giving a history to this cop here in the ditch? And but then he was going down a checklist, and then one of the questions was, have you been frustrated or angry about anything recently? I said, oh yes. And then he got very interested, he started checking things out. So he picked up, yes, what's that? He said, the foreign policy of my country. And he wrote it down, actually. And when I went and said that to the other people in jail, they said, why didn't I think of that? Well, that's very relevant here, because really, Manning was disgruntled and depressed. And one could say that a way to avoid that kind of thing, the kind of disgruntlement and depression that leads to leaking, is to avoid foreign policies that cannot stand public scrutiny because they confront your public employees with the awareness that they're participating, in Manning's words, that I was actively participating in something I was totally against. Now that's depressing in part, and a move for disgruntlement. I'll get in just a moment to precisely what that was, because I realized that it corresponded to my own life. very closely. So one thing would be to avoid those policies in the city. And the other thing would be, if you have evidence that somebody is critical of, skeptical, or disturbed by the policies which they are being asked to implement, because they report them to their superiors, that's a warning. That's what Manning did do. When he discovered that he was, as an intelligence specialist, was gathering up suspects, Iraqi suspects, to be given to Iraqi authorities. And we discovered two things: that we knew they were to be tortured, and were tortured. As the logs that he released on Iraq showed, they were routinely tortured, and often Americans were present. We knew they'd been tortured, and we saw them later. And under international law and domestic law, it was our obligation to do what we could to stop that, not just to protest it, but to stop it. In the first instance, by not giving them to authorities who are going to torture them. And second, to investigate it and to expose it. Actually, the Iraq war logs that someone disclosed, let's say Manning, investigated for that, was always accompanied by the admonition, do not investigate further. Now that again was a blatantly illegal order if you knew the law, because the international covenants that we've signed and ratified call for investigation of any credible report of torture. And whoever made that order, however far up it went, was giving a blatantly illegal order which should have been disobeyed. As far as we know, only one person did disobey, and that was Bradley Manning, let's say, who exposed it. And enormous instances. Why is the Obama administration so particularly sensitive about these releases? Not really more than Nixon was. Well, not more than Nixon was publicly about the Pentagon Papers. He tried to have prior restraints and was hurting national security. Any release would hurt national security, just as they're saying about WikiLeaks. But that was hypocritical, because privately, Nixon's attitude toward the Pentagon Papers, which ended in 1968, before he came into office, was it was great to have them out. He didn't like the example of somebody taking it on himself, me, to put them out. But once they were out there, he wanted them published as fast as possible, because they made the Democrats look bad. And that was exactly on the tapes. He was saying, can't we get more out? The injunction was only to the Times. Can't get it out. And to the others. The difference is that these logs go into Obama's time. And the torture I'm talking about was under Bush and Obama. Meaning that for the last 2 years, Obama's statement that he was totally against torture and meant to end it has been contradicted as explicitly, as deliberately as his promise to close Guantanamo. We are handing people over to torture under Obama, and that is just as illegal as if we were doing the torture ourselves and not merely observing it, as in many cases, in the same room and asking questions. So the torture is still going on. The illegality is still going on. That means that in principle, these documents incriminate the Obama administration, going up to the commander-in-chief. He does well to be a little concerned about that, although the chance that he will actually be brought before a court in this country, of course, is zero, and extremely low, except for foreign travel. And one of the things, of course, revealed by the latest state cables is that the Obama administration brought heavy pressure to bear on the Spanish government to end a case brought by the Spanish independent judiciary to hold lawyers and others in this country who had called for torture, who had rationalized it, and the people who did it, people like Rumsfeld and others, bring them to trial under universal jurisdiction. Torture is regarded as, like genocide, as a crime that has no international boundaries and no statute of limitations. There aren't too many like that. In fact, it's a crime that cannot be, in international law and UN, cannot be legalized by any country. You can't say we're out of that, we don't agree. It's illegal. And if the country of origin refuses to investigate or prosecute, any country in the world can do it. So Spain, Garzón, the guy who went against Pinochet, started a case. And we brought to bear pressure on the Spanish government to end that case, which they did, which meant intervening illegally in their own legal process to protect torturers. Okay, well, there's a reason for that. I must hope that his successor, whoever it is, will do the same for him, because he's just his subject. Okay. I want to address the question when the chat logs, which have led to Bradley Manning's being put under arrest now, which appear, if they're accurate, and no one has challenged their accuracy, came out on Wired magazine because Manning talked in chat logs, computer, to a former hacker named Adrian Lamo, who in turn gave the chat logs to Kevin Polson of Wired, and Wired has put out 25% of them only. They haven't given a good reason for why they withheld the other 75%. It's subject to a great controversy that's going on right now of whether they're complicit in this whole process. But anyway, in those logs, taking them for what they are, as I said earlier, Manning, I'm sorry, that's wrong what I just said. He was the single person convicted by a jury in such a prosecution for rape. I wasn't. And the next case was brought against the APAC members, the American Israel Political Action Committee, which was dismissed by Obama for a number of reasons. So we had one conviction. Obama has brought, until yesterday, 4 such cases, or more than all previous presidents put together. And the 5th indictment was brought yesterday. 5. If it goes after Assange, it'll be 6, twice as many as any previous prosecutions. In other words, Obama is using that act as the equivalent of an Official Secrets Act in Britain, which criminalizes all release of any classified information. Everyone probably, almost anyone in this audience probably, everyone assumes there is such an act in this country to start with somewhere. Must be something that makes it criminal to release classified information. So it's being said, universally almost, that Assange is obviously done something illegal. As I've said, that's very much in question. You can't say that he hasn't done anything that might lead to prosecution. He did. Well, actually, he's in the position of the New York Times. His source, let's call him Bradley Manning, because he's accused and suspected. He hasn't been proved, he hasn't pled on this. But I'll give him the honor, I'll give him the credit of using him as the possible source here, whoever that is. He's sitting in a prison right now in Quantico. And he's the counterpart to me on this. Well, he's accused of US 18793D. Having authorized access and unauthorized disclosure, as I was. As I say, I was the first. Now, the reason we don't have an Official Secrets Act, which clearly criminalizes this, is, as I've said, because of the First Amendment. It's always been held that such a law, which many administrations have proposed, and the CIA has lobbied for it for years, such a law has always been rejected, with one exception. The Congress always rejected it on the grounds that it simply restricted freedom of speech by far too much. Too many secrets would be kept from the public that should not be kept. Classification system is so enormously broad. It involves that to say that to release anything from it is just keeping too much from the public that they should know. So it would be unconstitutional in this country, even though you have it in Britain, and you have it in most countries. To use this act then effectively, clearly what Obama is trying to do, I would say, is one of 2 things, both. Ideally, from his point of view, since he wants to stop all leaks, they announced today, in connection with this new case, we're against all leaks. This was in context of being asked, what about Bob Woodward, whose book was entirely based on leaks, top secret information? We're against all leaks. That's it. The president pointed out he refused to discuss classified information in the hour he spent with Bob Woodward, showing his commitment to secrecy. But the book, of course, is filled with quotes from classified documents that were given by members of Obama's administration. There is no U.S. law that could be used to criminalize Assange or WikiLeaks, which would not apply exactly equally to the New York Times, or to any of the newspapers that have done this, or for that matter, to any network, any media, anybody who picks up the information which they know they are not authorized to get, and they weren't authorized to give, and if they give it, they're guilty under this reading of the Act. So that would be an enormous restriction then of speech in this country. It would make a big difference if we had the effect of an Official Secrets Act. And I'm saying what Obama clearly wants to do is to get a conviction. And of course, one of the factors here is that Assange is being demonized, a very unpalatable character, and openly his execution even discussed a great deal. But the sex charges against him, of course, helped to make him a good vulnerable, it looks like, to conviction by a jury. And to get that upheld on appeal, and to get it affirmed by the Supreme Court, and this Supreme Court might uphold it, where 20 or 30 years ago that might not have happened. And then we'd have the effect of an Official Secrets Act, which would mean, by the way, that finding the source of a leak would become very routine, very easy. You don't need any investigation. With a clear-cut crime of a leak, and I'm saying a leak might be prosecuted, it might be held to be illegal, but it's far from being a clear-cut crime at this moment. If it was a clear-cut crime, all you'd have to do is have a grand jury call in the journalist whose byline is on that story and say, we're not accusing you of anything, we just want to know who committed the crime, who gave you the information. And if they refuse, as Judith Miller did for 85 days, they go to prison, like Judith Miller. Most reporters would not go to jail for 85 days. Judith Miller credit for that. And then she decided to tell. Most of them would not. The leaks would not entirely cut off, because some people would leak anyway, but most of them would leak. Most of them would be cut off. And what we would have from then on is government by handout entirely. That's what we mostly have now. Or authorized leaks that serve the purpose of the government officials who make them, or the administration. But really unauthorized leaks that reveal crimes, errors, blunders, incompetence, deception, corruption. The things that are held as tightly as could be, as tightly as any national security secrets, they're not likely to get out even by somebody who understands that the public should know this information and it's wrongly being kept secret, because it would just be too easy to identify them, and whether you send them and to send them to prison. Even now, the risks, the administrative risks, short of prison, and as I'm saying, only 2 people have actually gone to prison for a leak. One under Obama pled guilty, and Samuel Warren Morrison. So that isn't, practically speaking, hasn't been a big realistic deterrent. But the chance of losing your clearance, losing your job, losing your promotion, losing your access, and losing the job and career with the clearance usually means a very great cut in income. When people leave the government with clearances, they use those clearances for even higher income in private industry or in consulting in various ways. So that's out. And the pressure of that on marriages is such that one study of whistleblowers said that the average length of marriage of a whistleblower after exposure is 18 months. Average. Some longer, and shorter. People just don't sign up for that. The pressures that they get, having to take their kids out of school and leave the country and lose all their friends, and that's what does happen, whether you're a corporate whistleblower or a government whistleblower, whether it involves classified information or not. Now, I said it wouldn't cut off all leaks. I can say that because it wouldn't have cut off my leak. I assumed there was an Official Secrets Act, and I assumed I was going to prison for the rest of my life. 7,000 pages, I thought, of top secrets would not go unnoticed. And in fact, I did face a possible 115 years in prison, adding up the charges that were brought against him. And I should say, by the way, right away, I just mentioned the effect on marriage. Our marriage, my wife is here, was a partner with me in this. And probably, that is, by the way, the suggestion that people have made for whistleblowers: don't keep your spouse in the dark as to what you're doing, because they haven't hit them, unexpectedly. The indictment or the loss of clearance, the loss of job is fatal, ultimately. But we were brought closer together. We were partners in this, and it's kept us together for 40 years. So I'm really lucky. That's exceptional. Okay, so as I say, I thought there was an official secret site. So having one, in effect, would not have stopped the Pentagon Papers, which led to just as big an investigation of how to stop leaks in the government, as has now been instituted by Obama. There's a huge set of regulations just went out.
Good evening. I'm Angie Brenner, the City Librarian for Mill Valley. Welcome to the first in our series of First Friday events, part of a year-long celebration of our library's centenary. Before giving a brief introduction, I'd like to express my deep appreciation for the exceptionally talented and dedicated staff of the library who are standing tonight. They are volunteering so they could attend this event and help out without taking up seats. I would also like to thank the Friends of the Library, without whose commitment and generosity this event would not be possible. Daniel Ellsberg will speak for about an hour, after which he will field questions from the audience. Following the Q&A, you're all invited to stay for a wine reception made possible by Mill Valley Market and an anonymous staff donation. This is pretty easy. Okay. When we first approached Dr. Ellsberg, we could not have known that we would soon be awash in a tidal wave of divulged classified information known as the WikiLeaks. Many of us may have noted in our reactions to this event a certain nonchalance, even cynicism. It isn't that we are unmoved, that we are not angered by depictions in these top secret documents of everything from gossipy political catfighting to nuclear brinksmanship reminiscent of the Cold War. Rather, we simply feel no surprise. And in place of surprise is a sense of déjà vu. We've seen this before. We've heard this before. We've been here before. 4 decades ago, our illustrious guest leaked to the East Coast media and select congressional leaders a collection of 7,000 clandestine documents detailing a quarter-century's worth of deceit, villainy, and corruption at the highest levels of government. The Pentagon Papers revealed to us not only that the Vietnam War was an unwinnable and depraved tragedy, but that we, the American public, had been hideously betrayed by the very statesmen in whom we had placed our absolute trust, that the firmest principles of our way of life and our most prized freedoms had been utterly traduced. However courageous and selfless that act of civil disobedience now strikes us, Dr. Ellsberg himself has been quick to remind us in interviews, public appearances, articles, books, that it was not some divine inner pacifism that drove him. Even if the courageous example of others prompted him finally to act, what changed his mind was information. It was what he read, it was what he found in documents obtained by illicit means, and it was information that should have been available to all of us as citizens of a presumably democratic and open society. Dr. Ellsberg, through that historic act and in his person, because he continues to advocate for transparency in the conduct of our public institutions, serves as a reminder, an enduring symbol, that it is access to the truth that will keep us free. Surely, the delightful irony of our meeting here in a public library, an institution whose very essence is, whose very existence is predicated upon free and equal access to information, cannot be lost on anyone in this audience. On that note, I would like you to join me in welcoming to the Mill Valley Public Library, Dr. Daniel Ellsberg.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just asked, actually, if the Pentagon Papers are in the library. I hope they are. If so, something that I just learned last week, actually, is that they're still classified, top secret in the eyes of the government. You know, they exist on library shelves all over the place. They were in the New York Times. But and there have been several requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, to declassify them. And they have never been declassified. They're still top secret. And that has some implications for any of you who might check them out, actually. Come to later. But if you are, for instance, a member of the U.S. government, the executive branch, or a family member of such a person, then her spouse or father or whoever it is may well have received notification just in the last few weeks that that person is forbidden to download from their office or home computer not only the WikiLeaks site or any of the documents that are on it, the classified documents, but the New York Times with any of the stories that are designated as classified and that are in the New York Times and all the other papers, which raises some very interesting questions. They can't do it on their home computers. They can't download it. And the law under which they're operating here, this is a government regulation, not a criminal law, but their clearance is at stake, as they pointed out. And it would seem to apply then to their, without authorization, showing any of those documents to any members of their family, handing the New York Times to a member of the family, or having a member of the family hand it to them. All these people. The member of the family, though not having a clearance, under the Espionage Act as interpreted by Obama's Department of Justice, would be a person unauthorized to receive this classified information, who is transmitting it without authorization to another person not authorized to receive it, and is violating that act, which is, each act of that is worth 10 years in prison. That may well seem absurd, maybe it is absurd, but it is also so clearly a violation of the First Amendment, so enormous an abridgment of free speech or of the press, that the Supreme Court should, and past Supreme Courts would, have declared that part of the law unconstitutionally overbroad, is the technical term, legally. Now, the Supreme Court has never actually addressed that question. No case of a leak has ever actually gone up to the Supreme Court and been addressed and confirmed. So Obama is using then, in the prosecutions he's been bringing, the indictments, and the indictment they're looking at for Julian Assange, an act of extremely questionable constitutionality. It's not impossible that the current court would decide otherwise, and probably Obama's Department of Justice hopes for that, to get a case up there, finally, which the Supreme Court will say this is properly addressed under the Espionage Act, even though it's well known that the Act was not intended to deal with leaks to the public, to unauthorized disclosures. It was intended to deal with espionage, with spies. But the language of these two particular provisions, 18 U.S.C. 793 D and E paragraphs, do lend themselves to an enormously broad set of prosecutions, such as I've just described to you. Now, a less absurd-looking prosecution was for the Pentagon Papers. What almost nobody knows is that was the first prosecution of a leak in this country. And the reason that my prosecution with Tony Russo was the first after 40 years or so after the law had been passed, even though leaks occurred every week, every other day, and still are. Mine was the first, was because, for the reason I've just given, the law was not intended for that purpose, and was always assumed that if it were used for that, it would be found unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. So they had refrained from ever bringing such a legal prosecution. After my case was dismissed for government misconduct, so it didn't lead to a decision of any sort, didn't go to an appellate court, 2 other presidents before Obama brought prosecutions for leaks under the same charges. One of them was for Samuel Loring Morrison, the grandson of the naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, who did plead guilty and had a 20-month sentence, of which he spent 8 months in prison. He was the single person ever prosecuted for a leak.